Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Despite my increasing sense of confusion in this particular work relationship, there was one thing I knew for certain. Something wasn't right, though I couldn't identify exactly what. Why did I always feel so dazed and overwhelmed after conversations with this person? Whenever I confronted them about their inappropriate behavior, why did I walk away apologizing and questioning my own perception and judgment? I was often told that I couldn't take a joke and that I was being too sensitive. Was I being too sensitive? This person had a way of retelling what happened to shift the blame onto me. Was it my fault? But the most frustrating part about this relationship wasn't what this person did, but who I became when I was around them. I couldn't seem to hold on to myself. Whenever I was around this person, I didn't know how to stay in control of me. I was in constant fight or flight, and it was like I lost control of my body, as if I was suddenly disconnected from my own sense of self. How I planned to engage with them and what I planned to say never actually happened. My clarity and confidence would always dissipate into self-doubt, and I'd slide into a role of making myself small and saying whatever I knew was necessary to please them. In one sense, I realized how important it is to have so much compassion for these strategies. For all of us, the first step towards shifting our interactions with emotionally immature people is to recognize how the strategies that we've relied on up to this point have helped us and protected us. But in another sense, I knew that making myself small and people-pleasing was not who I was, and I had no idea how to get me back or keep me back. At the time, I didn't have language for this person's emotional immaturity or my emotional dysregulation during our interactions. Despite the confusion and self-doubt constantly swirling around in my mind, my body was telling me that something was off. And that's one of the beautiful things about how God designed our bodies. They never lie. They often speak the truth that our mouths can't or won't say, or that our minds don't know yet. As you've listened to this series on adult children of emotionally immature parents, maybe you can relate to this sense of confusion, frustration, and discouragement over who you become or the role that you find yourself playing in a relationship with a primary caregiver or other emotionally immature person in your life. While we can't change the person, we can learn ways of interacting with emotionally immature people without sacrificing or losing parts of ourselves. So in this last episode of the series, we're going to talk about some practical approaches for interacting with emotionally immature people. But to set up our conversation, let's first talk about this. What is the ultimate goal of interacting with an emotionally immature person? The goal is this: to stay in control of our own mind and feelings. As I just mentioned, while we may long for this person to recognize and change their behavior, we can't control whether or not they do. However, we can learn ways of holding on to ourselves in these relationships. To do this, we have to stay observational, noticing how we're feeling and how the other person is acting. As you see in my story, and perhaps have experienced personally, this is much more difficult than it may seem. But when we learn how to keep an observational perspective, which we're going to talk about today, we can stay centered no matter how the other person behaves. This also helps to keep us in our thinking brain instead of falling into our emotions or a fight or flight reaction. In this way, we can hold onto who we are and what we need and value instead of feeling stuck in old roles and expectations. Now, it's so important to acknowledge the complexity and diversity in all of our experiences. It takes discernment and thoughtful care to determine if, when, and how we engage with certain people in our lives. Sometimes our assessment may lead us to conclude that distance and no contact is the best course of action. Other times, we may realize that we need time and space before engaging. And still other times, as in the case for this episode, we may recognize that we need different tools and approaches for these relationships. So let's jump into 3 practical steps for interacting with an emotionally immature person. For the first step, we practice detached observation. What do I mean by this? Well, let's use my example to explore what detached observation is not. Whenever I interacted with the emotionally immature person I referenced at the beginning of this episode, I attempted to engage with them emotionally. The more my feelings and perspective was invalidated, the more dysregulated I became. Why? Because I was operating out of the belief that if they didn't validate me, I wasn't okay. When I interacted with this person, I constantly hoped that if I could say everything just the right way and do everything just right, maybe then they would finally change. This approach never worked. Rather, it simply made me feel more weak, vulnerable, apprehensive, and needy. If this cycle feels familiar, we can see it as a valuable signal to shift out of responding emotionally and into observing mode. So what exactly is detached observation? This is the intentional practice of moving into an observational, detached frame of mind. We focus on silently noticing what is happening externally and internally as we interact with this person, noticing how this person is behaving, and then noticing how this makes us feel. As you're probably realizing, staying observational isn't passive. It's a very active process. This frame of mind helps us to stay centered and operate out of a calm, thinking perspective rather than emotional reactivity. When we practice detached observation, we can create some distance between ourselves and this person, even as we're interacting with them. It gives us a place to stand outside of the interaction so that we can observe what is happening from a neutral perspective. Detached observation is invaluable in creating a buffer against getting hurt or finding ourselves emotionally ensnared by the other person's behavior. It also helps us to emotionally untangle ourselves and stay in touch with our own needs, thoughts, and feelings. The more we practice detached observation, the stronger and more confident we'll become in our ability to see what's really going on. Let's move on to the second step, which is we accurately assess. My guess is that if you're listening to this episode, you are listening for a reason. And I'm going to make the assumption that when you saw the title of this episode, a specific name or face came to mind. And you started listening because either consciously or not, you've been willing to name this person's emotional immaturity. And you've also been willing to judge some of their actions as wrong. Now, let me pause here because I want to name something that you might be thinking right now. Isn't it wrong to judge others? And doesn't Jesus tell us not to judge? If you're thinking this, these were my exact thoughts too as I've been reflecting on this step. But as I've been studying how the word judgment is used throughout Scripture, I've realized that there are 2 very different meanings to this word. The first meaning is the one that I think most of us instinctively envision when we hear the word judge, which is to condemn someone from a position of self-righteousness. Jesus warns us against this kind of judgment in Matthew 7, when he talks about taking the speck out of another person's eye without first removing the plank out of our own eye. But there is a second meaning to this word judgment that I believe Jesus calls each of us to engage in, and it's the practice of making accurate assessments. In other words, we are called to make distinctions, to discern what is right from wrong, and to name things accurately. This practice of making accurate assessment is how Jesus calls us to carefully evaluate others and our own hearts with integrity, with clarity, and with honesty. Scripture doesn't warn us against judgment per se, but judgment against. So what does this look like practically in an interaction with someone who is emotionally immature? In this case, accurately assessing looks like estimating the probable emotional maturity level of this person and taking this into account as we engage with them. In other words, how emotionally mature or immature is this person? What level of emotional maturity are they operating at? And what is happening inside of me as I interact with them? Once we have a general idea of this person's emotional maturity level, their responses will make more sense and will be more predictable, and we have more of the clarity we need to shift our responses accordingly. And finally, the third step is this: we re-enter the relationship in a different way. Every relationship involves a dance between two roles, and this dance is either healthy or unhealthy. In this third step, as we continue to stay in observational mode and practice accurate assessment, we can begin to more clearly see the specific role that we've fallen into within this relationship. Is there an imbalance of power, or is power being misused? Does one person call the shots and the other person never speak up? Is one person emotionally reactive and the other person walks on eggshells? Does one person get really big and the other person get really small? Does one person consider only their opinion as valid and the other person refrain from sharing their thoughts out of fear of a critical response? Does one person never take responsibility for their actions while the other person takes over responsibility? Is one person never at fault and the other person is always at fault? Does one person act egotistically and the other person enable? Most of these roles are often played subconsciously, and recognizing the specific role that we've played is how we can begin to re-enter these relationships in new ways. Again, what's the goal here? To stay emotionally regulated. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, when we can stay in control of our thoughts and feelings, we have the emotional capacity to decide how we show up. And showing up in a calm, regulated way helps to break this dysfunctional dance. While the other person may still operate out of their old role, we can become confident enough in our ability to see what's really going on to stop playing ours. We feel connected inside of ourselves, not fragmented or disoriented. We feel settled in our voice and perspective, not doubtful or fearful. And because of this, we can operate from a grounded, more authentic place rather than a role that we may have previously felt trapped in, and regardless of how the other person responds. Some questions to consider as you begin reflecting on your interactions with an emotionally immature person. What role do I play with this person? What dysfunctional or hurtful relational dance do I repeatedly find myself in? And what might be God's invitation here? Refusing to play our old role and engage in this dance is a profound act of grace. So to wrap up this episode, I just want to give us a moment to reflect on what I just said. Do you see these 3 steps: detached observation, accurate assessment, and re-entering the relationship in a new way as acts of grace? As I've thought about this question, I've been pondering what grace is, and I think we've often misinterpreted grace as something that is passive or that requires us to blindly look past wrongdoing. I've experienced and I've heard many stories of people manipulating the word grace to mean something other than real grace. They use this pretend, fake definition of grace to cover up abuse, gaslighting, and all sorts of other kinds of harm. But Jesus didn't die for sin to be ignored and truth to be silenced, and certainly not in the name of extending grace. The grace that Jesus died for is a fierce, warrior-like kind of grace. A grace that turns the lights on in a room and does not pretend that it does not see. A grace that tells the truth and that responds to reality with courageous love rather than twisting or distorting it. So as we end, I'd love to invite you to consider what real grace is. How might this shift the way that you view grace and what it looks like to offer grace in your relationships? I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.